Here we go. All right. Well, welcome to the Gospel of John. Today we're going to focus on the introduction, and I've usually said in classes I'm usually not one that's into the introduction. I just want to jump into the text, but there's some good things I think we can go through in the introduction, and then we'll cover the first part of chapter 1 through 18, which is commonly called the prologue to the Gospel. There we go. Okay. There we go. So just some distinctive characteristics on the gospel broadly, and we'll touch on some of these things later in more detail as we move through the class. But there's a good use of the Old Testament in the Gospel of John, different allusions or references to Jesus. Jesus appeals to in terms of Old Testament characters, and then he uses Old Testament passage to respond to his opponents. We'll see some things in the Gospel of John where it says the Jews, and that's an important distinction. What is, we'll get into the details, but what does that mean, the Jews? And what it seems to really mean is the Jewish leaders. And there are times when Jesus is engaged with the Jewish leaders. And if you really think about it, Jesus and his early disciples were Jews. And so what we'll see a lot of these when he's responding to opponents, they tend to be the leaders of the Jews, Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes, and so forth. Teaching on the Holy Spirit, there's more to say about the Holy Spirit in the Gospel of John than the Synoptic Gospels. And just for reference, the Synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, thought to be very similar to each other. In fact, some historians, go back and say maybe those three had a common source that then they split off from there. That's a more controversial, subject. But John's gospel is distinctly different. And what we see in the Spirit when in Jesus' farewell discourse, there's some text on the Spirit's work that's found there. Unique presentation of Jesus. He's the Son sent by the Father. We see a lot of the humanity of Jesus where we might not see as much in the Synoptic Gospels on that. He's presented as a human, but as we'll see here at the very beginning of the Gospel, the importance of really establishing who he is as Jesus as God, is God in the flesh. A little more on the personal inner life of Jesus is emphasized in John's gospel than what we'll see in the synoptics. And then this word logos, which we'll get to very quickly here in the prologue, the word that Jesus is referred to. We see unique presentations of Jesus' work, the 7 signs or the 7 miracles that we see. And if I remember from my class, there are only 2 of those that are mentioned in the Synoptic Gospels. There are 5 new signs or miracles that are mentioned in John's Gospel that are not in the other Gospels. The 7 I am statements that he has. And then there's themes on light, live, love, truth, or some unique themes that come out in a discourse. Significant material in the synoptics is omitted by John. So when we look at the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then look at the Gospel of John, there are certain things that John does not talk about. And I've listed some of them here: the virgin birth, Jesus' temptations, the transfiguration, institution of the Lord's Supper. However, I will say that we will touch on some areas that you go, that might be a reference to the Lord's Supper there, but it's not, as specific as it would be in the Synoptic Gospels. Casting out demons, and then a lot of the narrative parables. We don't see that in the Gospel of John. Jesus' agony at Gethsemane is not there. We do see, Jesus in the garden and the soldiers coming to get him there, but we don't see that agony that we see in the other Gospels. And then the call of the disciples is somewhat assumed. And we'll touch on a minute, maybe why some of these things are not as much emphasized in this gospel as in the synoptics. The other thing, the additional material, and I talked about some of this, so the miracle at Cana, the water to wine, that's not mentioned in the synoptics. The meeting with Nicodemus when he comes and, what must I do to be born again? or that Jesus says, you need to be born again. The encounter with the Samaritan woman, the healing of the lame man. So there's two miracles right there. We've got miracle at Cana, healing of the lame man. I've got healing of the lame man twice. I didn't mean to do that. The man born blind would be 3, and the raising of Lazarus would be 4. That are not mentioned in the synoptics. A lot of the public discourses, private discourses, and then what people refer as the passion narrative. Once we get to, the kind of the last days or week of Jesus' life, there's a lot of additional material in the Gospel of John that we won't find in the synoptics. And then other thing is presentation is different. The more discourse material, Jesus, his role is really, his teaching role is referred to as rabbi. There's simpler Greek vocabulary. And then there's some chronological challenges. And we talked about this in my class. There's a couple of things, not only chronological challenges, but also some difficulties with material in the gospel, and whether they belong or where do they come from. So the date of the cleansing of the temple, the length of Jesus' ministry, there are 3 specific Passovers mentioned in John's gospel. And so you go, okay, that's 3 years, possibly a 4th that's mentioned in chapter 5. It's we're not sure, but if it were 4, that might indicate a little bit longer length of his ministry than we might be used to. The Last Supper, was it Wednesday or Thursday? If we start looking at how John puts it out there, was Jesus crucified on Thursday or Friday? And then Pilate, I wish I'd have referenced this, but in the John's gospel, it might be he mentions the 6th hour, which in the synoptics it's the 3rd hour, or vice versa. But John says it one way, and I think it may not be all the synoptics. Mark says it different. And we'll talk a little bit about the use of time for one thing. That won't really necessarily resolve this, but the Jews and the Romans had a different sense of time. So when they said the 6th hour for the Romans, that meant one thing. When they said the 6th hour for the Jews, that meant something else. So that's something we'll talk about. I talked about not just the chronological challenges I didn't put in here, but also there's some textual challenges. And I don't want to get into a lot of detail. The most significant one is at the end of John 7, the conversation that Jesus has with the woman caught in adultery. There's a lot of feeling that doesn't belong. That and when we get to that section, we'll talk about it a little bit. It's not really important to really make a huge point of it, but just to be aware of it. But there's thought of some of the earliest manuscripts did not have that section, so somehow it ended up the Gospel of John, and it was left there. And so we'll talk about that when we get to that, about how that ended up being left in the Gospel of John. But there's some other just little pieces that John may say something a little bit different than what others said, and so people start, there's always critics of things, and anywhere, with anything, you look at any of these books in the Bible or in the New Testament, and there's always this, well, did this person really write it, or maybe it was this other person, or I'm not sure that this person really wrote it. And you get that with the Gospel of John. And so the same thing with some of these chronological challenges, to go, well, the Bible's inconsistent, we can't really trust it because there's differences in things. There's some ways to look at it and work around it. But we need to remember this is the inspired Word of God. And any of these difficulties like this could be more from a human difficulty than from God. And how the writings were collected and kept together. So we'll get into some of those difficulties a little bit, but won't belabor them. But just to have an awareness, if you encounter somebody saying, "Hey, I see these inconsistencies in the Gospel of John versus what, let's say, Mark said." As far as authorship, there's no explicit passages. It doesn't say, John writing to you from greetings and so on and so forth. What a commentator named Westcott, a theologian named Westcott, his kind of thing was, what we know is this person who wrote it was a Jew, probably of Palestine, an eyewitness, an apostle, and finally his conclusion, as well as many others, and the predominant feeling is it was John the apostle. So as a Jew, this person seemed to be very familiar with Jewish customs and opinions of the day. Really good knowledge of the Jewish observances, things like the different feasts, the Passover, observances. So pretty good knowledge of those things. The style it's written in Greek, but there's definitely a Hebrew background in the style. And then I mentioned just the Old Testament being a source of religious life for the author. So the person that wrote it was probably a Jew. They seemed to have a pretty good knowledge of the topography. So this kind of goes back to Palestine. So he talks about Bethany beyond the Jordan, and also talks about Bethany near Jerusalem, a couple of different Bethanies. Kind of puts in the extra Cana of Galilee. So you'll see other references as cities are brought up that gives pretty good indication of this person had a pretty good idea of the map of again, the topography of the area. Is an eyewitness. There's a couple of different references I've just named here. We saw his glory. He who has seen has testified, as the book is coming to a close there. So this person was an eyewitness. And then the author was apostle. There was some feeling this person seemed to know people's thoughts, had some special power, and recalled the word the apostles spoke. So it was around the apostles. And so then most people come to say the writer was John. And then date and place. Some start off with kind of a wide net between AD 70 and AD 175. And then you start to narrow that down then to say, well, we've got this papyrus called P52 is a papyrus that exists today, is in a library, and it's dated in the early half of the 2nd century, or the early 100s. And so that's an indication of at least one of the first either copies, or I don't know if it's the original, but one of the early copies, if you will, of the Gospel of John, and some fragments. Historically, people believe John lived somewhere between 280-98 to 117, fairly old, fairly late 1st century to early 2nd century. And so the consensus of most people starts to say it's probably written somewhere between 80 and 95. So, why is that important? Well, there's a sense to where you have somebody writing about things that happened some time ago, not just about Jesus and the time he lived, but other things that had happened since then. So so after the day of Pentecost, this would have been written well after that, and also after the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. So that would bring a certain lens or perspective that this writer would be writing, knowing things that would happen. So, it just creates a different lens, on their ability to write, having seen several years happen. And that explains or perhaps explains maybe why John doesn't spend much time on the Lord's Supper at all. He sort of, there's some potential references. It's one of those things where if you put your lenses on, your Lord's Supper lenses on, and read passage, you go, that's the Lord's Supper. Or you put your baptism lens on and you read passage, you go, oh, that's baptism. You can draw those things, but they're not necessarily the purpose or the main point of what he was writing about. And so some have said, well, maybe if you're, 40, 50 years away from some of these other things that happened, or maybe more than that, 60 or so years, there's a bit of perspective and a bit of assumption. You say, well, the Lord's Supper, of course, we all know about that. We've been doing that for whatever it is, 40, 50, 60 years. Not much else for me to say about it. So that could explain some of the differences that we see. Tradition says that he wrote in Ephesus, and we won't get into a lot of detail on that. So purpose, I think the it's pretty well agreed that this John 20, 30, and 31 is a purpose statement for, in fact, a lot of Bibles, the bold title right above this section says, purpose of the gospel. And so starting in verse 30, now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. The word believe in this gospel is written somewhere in the neighborhood of 250 times, which is almost 40% of its use in the New Testament. So for this class, we had to write a final paper. Actually, it wasn't final. It was kind of it was a paper for the class that had to be done. I don't know, 4 weeks before the class was over, so we had time to present to our fellow classmates. But one of the choices was on the section about adultery at the end of chapter 7, and I thought I'll take that one. Well, it was gone. Somebody else picked it. So all the ones were picked over, and so I had to come up with something. So the paper I wrote was the use of the word believe in the Gospel of John. What did he mean by the word believe? Think of John 3:16, the most famous verse that even those who have just an association with Christianity can quote that verse. Or I think about when in the 1970s and early 80s, the guy that stood behind home plate at the baseball game that had his John 3:16 shirt on. So what did he mean by the word believe? And certainly it was a very important topic. And here in this kind of purpose, he talks about that the whole reason he's writing this gospel is that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ. And so I'll try to weave in some thoughts on what I found in my study on the word believe, but a very important topic. So the other thing that comes about is this so that people may come to believe? So those who don't believe, that it's written for those who may come to believe, and or is it written for those to encourage them to continue to believe even more fervently? So these are written that you may come to believe. These are written so that you may believe more fervently, believe more convincingly. Could be either, and we'll do some talking on that a little bit later in the class. So that's purpose. Okay, that's the introduction. Any thoughts or questions?
Yeah, I find the writing of this gospel fascinating because I'm picturing the scene that John, say 80s, 90s, living in Ephesus, okay? And there's people there that are Christians, most of them born long after the events took place, a long distance away. And even though they might believe, it's kind of like, yeah, this thing happened a long time ago and a long distance away, and all this stuff happened. But there's a guy here that saw all of it. And I was reading some on the church fathers before we talked about this tonight. Irenaeus was a disciple of Polycarp, who was the disciple of John. So he's basically a second tier disciple. And he said, yeah, John, son of Zebedee, was the guy who wrote this. And I saw a couple of things. I think it might have been who's one started with C. Anyway, a couple of people said that he was urged to write this by people around him, and I can see that if I was there, I would have said, "John, write some of this stuff down." And and there's debate about was he able to write it physically, but it certainly was under his authority. But I think about this stuff. I think this is great, because you get a couple of these disciple of a disciple, you're getting into sort of modern day history, and it somehow makes it more real, I guess.
Absolutely, and that's part of. I'm glad you brought that up. About Polycarp, and that is part of what helped to identify the author. That's kind of some of the external evidence. Is the people closest to that time said, "Oh yeah, it was John." So if he didn't leave, he left some internal evidence with he's a Jew, somebody from Palestine, things like that. But some of the external evidence had to do with those who lived shortly after John's life. or,
Yeah,
or during his life as a disciple of him. Yeah.
Ron, if I recall, aren't there instances in the gospel where he's talking about John, but he says the disciple whom Jesus loved. I mean, that also shows the relationship that John had with Jesus, that he was very close to Jesus. Out of the 12, Jesus did had specific experiences with James, John, and Peter, I believe. But even out of those three, it seemed like he was closest to John. So we do get some insight, I think, into Jesus' specific mission. And I think John wrote this for a different purpose than the other three gospels. And he wrote it, as you mentioned in 20 verse 30, that to kind of show the deity of Christ. That's really what he wanted to emphasize, that Jesus really was the Son of God.
Yeah.
They were starting to get into some of the Gnostic type stuff, and so John is to say, of course, he was a witness, and he's, as we see in chapter 1, he says the Word was made flesh. In other words, it wasn't some mystical appearance that these guys are talking about, and yeah, the deity, and of course the I am statements where God says. One of my favorite parts of the book of John is where they say, what, you aren't 50 years old and you've seen Abraham? And Jesus said, before Abraham was, I am. He didn't say before Abraham was, I was. He said, I am. And as soon as they said that, they say he's claiming to be God.
Yeah. David, I was thinking about, the disciple whom Jesus loved. And my recollection from, again, just recent study was that didn't happen until the Last Supper, when they were reclining at the table. I think if I remember it, I think that's the first time Jesus referred to him that way. So you go pretty much into, I don't know, 17, 18 chapters, something like that, before he's referred that way. But yeah, that's another internal sign. And you piece a couple together and go, okay, the disciple whom Jesus loved, it seems to be John. So that's good. Yeah, it'd be some of the internal evidence. But yeah, there's always some scholar that wants to go the other direction on these kind of things, right? But the general consensus is it's the Apostle John. Anything else on the introduction? There's something I thought about and I lost it there. Maybe it'll pop into my head as we go into what we call the prologue. But no, it's a fascinating book. It is, and sometimes I think we think of, if you had one book you wanted to hand somebody and say, all right, you're not a Christian, you're interested in Christianity, you hand somebody the Bible and the temptation is, well, let's start at Genesis, we'll go to Exodus, and you go, oh, no, don't do that. You'll run out of gas, by the time you get to Leviticus or something, or, Numbers, Deuteronomy, you'll run out of gas before you ever get to it. And there's kind of a feeling like, all right, if I want somebody to just get a start, give them the Gospel of John and read this. That can be a general feeling. Something like Hebrews is, just difficult. Don't start there. Matthew, Mark are fine, but you get into a lot of the genealogies up front, and that's something else to talk about. Is where did Matthew and Mark start? They start with the birth of Jesus, and John starts with, I'm starting before that. I'm going way back to the beginning. To start there rather than the physical birth of Jesus. Okay. Okay, so let's jump into the text. We'll try to cover 1 through 18 this evening. So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him and who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. Glory is the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness about him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me. For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, only God, who is at the Father's side. He has made him known." So one of the things I did, I saw something not like this, but something read up in a book that just had, it was word, God, that kind of thing. Here's the key words. And so I punched these words into one of these word cloud apps, online. And these are, gives you the idea of how many, just in this section, the number of times various, words are mentioned. So witness is pretty large. God is probably the biggest one here. Light is very big. Word. And remember, I talked about the very beginning in the introduction, light, word. Those are key words that come up through the gospel. Beginning, came, made, world. You see some of the bigger words there, give you an idea of a word count, if you will, that are given here. But certainly, this unfolds a message about God, from God, about the Word, who the Word is, about light, about the light coming, the Word coming, the beginning. What happened in the beginning? And the word "made" is in here very much. So just kind of interesting to see how that comes out in a word cloud here as we get the word count on various words in this section. So the Word and God, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. Sounds a lot like Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So John starts with eternity, where, like I mentioned, the other Gospels do not. This word, the Word in the beginning is the Word. That's the Logos. This Word is eternal. It was there in the beginning. It has personality. It was with God. And this is a very, not just, kind of alongside God, but this personal relationship that existed. The Word has personality, has this relationship. Also gives us the personal nature of the Word, that the Word is fully God, not a God, but fully God. And I was reading, as the Jehovah's Witnesses, I think that, believe that Jesus was created, and like to insert in the word "a," that the Word was a God, and that's not really what's seen here. The Word was God. The Word was God, was the God, if you want to put it that way. The Word in creation, all things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. So all of a sudden we see this word life coming out a few times here. It looks like 3 times in this passage. Darkness coming out a couple times. All things came into being through him. This creation of life. So in Genesis 1:3, I guess first thing created was the light. There was darkness, and then light was created. So life is the word life is used in one way or another some 36 times in John's gospel. So another important word that's used. And I referenced Genesis 1:3, let there be light. The light shines, it dispels the darkness. It's present, not past. It is. So we kind of see a transition of all things were made. Without him was not anything that was made. And then it's in him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness. So we see a bit of a transition to, light being in the present form. And even in the continuous form, the light continues to do this. Any thoughts on that first section on just in the beginning is the Word, Word is God, the light, life? We'll jump into John the Baptist. Good. Okay. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. This is believed to be John the Baptist, whose name was John. It's not the same John the Apostle, but John the Baptist, somebody sent from God, but with authority and personal, like a personal representative God that is serving as a witness to lead people to believe. We see the idea of testimony or witness. That's about 14 times in John's gospel, and there's a related verb that comes up about 33 times. But only that variation of the word, the verb, is only twice in the synoptics. So again, we see back to some words, like I said, believe, that's used. Almost 40% of the word believe in the New Testament is in the Gospel of John. We see some words like witness or testimony or some variation that is that's heavily used in the Gospel of John and not the synoptics. So here's a comparison. Jesus was from all eternity. John came. John came into the world. Jesus is the Word. John was a mere man. Jesus himself is God. John is commissioned by God. I should say commissioned by God. Jesus is the real light. John bore witness of the light. Jesus is the object of trust. John was the agent through whom people came to believe in the light. So they had different roles, different purposes. One being John, introducing the other in Jesus. John the man, John the one who was came from, sent by God, but to introduce the one who's been from all eternity. Any thoughts on that, the John the Baptist section?
If you recall, Jesus said that John the Baptist was essentially the greatest prophet, even greater than Elijah and Moses, specifically because he was preparing the way for Jesus.
Right. Okay. Anybody else?
It's interesting that, not only in John, but in the synoptics, God really thinks it's important to let us know that John came and that Jesus didn't just kind of start this out on his own when it comes from that earthly part, that John prepared the way, that God really puts an emphasis on that in the synoptics and in John.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so let's talk about the Word Incarnate now. Verse 9, the true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him. Yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glories of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. So we kind of break this section apart a little bit, and a little bit smaller font there to get it all on here. But this light is the true light. It's real, it's genuine, it's authentic. And it talks about enlightening every man. But that doesn't mean that every man has benefited from it. Every man has benefited from it in the light being able to show us the path. If you think of it that way, it's universal that every man has been shown the right path, but not everyone has taken advantage of that and walked the right path, or in fact, walked in darkness. We'll talk about that here in a second. So this light coming into the world, Jesus was rejected. The world did not know him, and he was rejected by his own. He's rejected by the Jews, really to some degree rejected by his family, to some degree, and until maybe much later. We'll see some interesting thoughts there later on. Even when we see the wedding at Cana, and the interesting pivot that we see Mary make there, like she knew Jesus, but almost like I didn't know him like that. What we see at the wedding of Cana. To back up a second, because I can't remember if I have. Okay, we'll go the word believe. I want to touch on that. So. But so why was he rejected? Well, a couple of things. Some people like the darkness more than the light. That's the way they prefer to live. That's the way they preferred to live then. And you look at this list and you go, yeah, a lot of these still apply. Some people just love the darkness more than the light. Some are afraid of what others think. And we see that in these references in John. Some people are just misinformed. They don't understand. Some are just hardened by their traditions. They don't want to leave their traditions for this, to accept Jesus. Some people just love the praise of men more than the praise of God. And this isn't, completely exhaustive, but a list here of some of the things that at least John points out of reasons why Jesus could be rejected. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. Glory is the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. God became flesh. The Word then, and this is like a key verse in John, in this prologue, and you think of this prologue as like, people talk about elevator speeches and things like that, or the you want to have some kind of trailer, if you will, for the movie, that these first 18 verses go, this is kind of what this thing's going to be all about. God becomes flesh. The Word is Jesus, and it's not some kind of force, it's not the force be with you. As you see, if you read this for the first time and go, what is this Word? What is that all about? And then you finally go, the Word became flesh. Oh, it's the Son. Oh, it's Jesus. Okay. And lived among us. And so you see now what this word really is all about, what that word means. The word, David, you've mentioned, that Jesus surpasses John the Baptist and Moses. And John cries out, to bring this message that how important it is. Jesus existed before John the Baptist. He says, no one has seen God. And you go, well, what about Moses and Isaiah? They saw God. Well, perhaps not in this way, though. This is God's essence. By Jesus coming, God coming in the flesh as Jesus presents a whole new way of us seeing God that perhaps even Moses and Isaiah didn't, see, or way they saw God, if you will. I want to go back to the word believe, because I want to kind of hit the, since I wrote a paper on it, I want to hit the word believe. So I miss it here. I got to go back another.
In verse 12.
Where did I miss it? Yeah, help me. There we go. But all who did not receive him, who believed in his name. Okay, so when we receive Jesus, all who did not receive him, when we receive Jesus, it said we believe in his name. We get to John 3:16, and you believe. And so something I want to plant into your mind is, as we go through this study and we see the word believe pop up, is what does that mean? And maybe you have friends, colleagues, relatives, whatever, who use this. Hey, if you believe on his name, you'll be saved. And you get to John 3:16, all who believe. What does that mean? What does believe really mean? And that was kind of my interest in writing the paper on that. Does that just mean to believe on his name, to go, I believe there was a guy named Jesus, and okay, so he was a son of God. And people have varying, they say, he was a great teacher back in years and years and years ago, and that he was just a great Jewish teacher. That's who he was. And others might then assign some deity to him. Yeah, he's they may not think of it that way, but they'll think there's this definite association, or he's the son of God. And I believe that. And so we'll see that, those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Well, that's pretty amazing. I just need to believe on his name, and I'm a child of God. And as we strive to understand the church in the New Testament and understand the teaching of the New Testament, we go, well, so that's it? I just need to believe on his name, and I'm a child of God. And does believe just mean, like I said, it's kind of a mental assent. It would be kind of the lowest level belief, maybe, that, well, I believe, so cool. I'll go out about my life, and everything's good. Or is there more, because John brings it up 250 times to say there's more for us to really think about. And again, if that topic sentence was, this was written so you may believe man, you spend a lot of time talking about how to believe. If that's all there is to it, is to go, yeah, I believe, mental assent. So, as we get to the word believe through this gospel, we'll look at that. We'll look at how that's used. Sometimes the word faith might be used there in a very similar, rather than believe, but the same idea. So that's part of what we'll be digging into. So I think that's it I had on my presentation here through 18. Any comments on what I just said there about believe or anything else before we kind of close out for the evening?
I was just thinking, as you mentioned, this being like a prologue, and that idea, and it does everything that a good prologue ought to do. You compared it to that elevator pitch, and this section really does grab you. And I almost think if we're, especially as much as some of this is so familiar to us, if we kind of lose how big the impact of these 18 verses is, but it when you realize, and particularly if you put yourself in the perspective of somebody with a Jewish background and the claims about Jesus that this makes, even if you were already a Christian and accepted those, this really restates those things in a very forceful way with a lot of impact, and it leaves you wanting more.
Right.
And so and you think about the time of this writing, Christianity has now been around long enough for some of those older Christians to maybe become settled in their ways, and this, I think this would wake you up and to remind you of just how big a deal Jesus is. He's not just some self-help guru. He is God. And to cause you to want to look back and to remember everything that you've learned about Jesus and all the more that John's about to tell you.
Yeah, I think as you're saying, David, you're looking at second generation Christians by now too, right? Maybe even kind of getting close to third, maybe. Yeah.
We mentioned, more than just believing to be his children. And the section that I thought about was Thomas, and I don't know if that really applies, but for some reason that just came to mind, where Thomas finally sees him and says, "Yeah, you're my Lord, my God, and I believe now," and everything. Jesus said, "You believe because you saw. Blessed are those who have not seen and believed." And of course, it ties in with the whole book about belief.
Yeah, and a couple of things. I'm glad you brought that up. Because you start your mind kind of starts going through the Rolodex of the word believe and thinking about. So did Thomas believe before that?
I don't think so.
Well, I think he did. I mean, he believed enough to be there, right? But in other words, he believed in Jesus as the Christ, but it's almost like, and this we'll talk about, it's almost like he reached a higher state of belief now. And that's part of what I put in my paper. Are there different stages of belief? So I believe, but is another thing to say, I believe to the point where I'm willing to put my life on the line.
Right. There's obedient belief.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm reminded of what James tells us, that the demons believe and tremble, but
Right.
they don't obey.
Right.
But he says they do believe that, Jesus exists and is the Son of God, but they don't obey.
Hi, Susan. I saw your hand go up. I think.
Hi. Yeah. Actually, he just brought up the part about like even the demons knew, and obviously Satan knew. So it can't. We know, we can reason through that. It can't be just because you know that Jesus existed, right? Or that God created everything. There has to be more variable in there. So belief is along with taking action. Somebody once brought it, like, you could say that's a chair and that chair will hold me, but until you sit in it with full faith, and sometimes believe and belief and faith can sort of sometimes be used synonymously, but I don't think they really are. And so it's basically taking action on whatever's said in 100% that it is true, and then watching it play out. But you're going in with that quote unquote blind faith of 100% all in. And I think we can see how it doesn't work for those that are called, excuse me, or we see cafeteria, I won't say the one group that I know that's being used with, but cafeteria folks. And we all, maybe some of us even experience in our own journey about when we sort of get in there, we're like, oh, can we have this? And if you only give me this, but then we sometimes, take the wheel back from Jesus and say, no, it's not going the way I prayed. And that I, say whatever, go along with whatever your answer is. So I think that whole belief is really that deep of a commitment to where you are taking it, like you said, to the point of death.
Yeah. Yeah. And that was what was the most fascinating, I guess, for me in this paper was just, peeling it back and going, oh, okay, boy, there's a lot here. And even the apostles, if you want to think of it, Jesus goes, hey, come follow me. And they go, okay. So that they had some level of belief, but then, Peter denies Jesus and said, well, apparently he had enough belief to follow him. And then he has this kind of lapse in belief, if you will, to be called out for it and deny it. And you go, and then he comes back to where he's there on the day of Pentecost. Sorry,
well,
Susan.
and even, yeah, that's a good one too, because even with him going out on the waves, right? I relate to Peter so much out of all the disciples. So he's like the first one to get out of the boat when Jesus is calling him, and he's okay for a moment, and then he starts sinking. And that's so relatable. We can be like, oh yeah, we're Christians, we're all in, I believe this. And then something hits the fan in our life, right? And then we can falter into that questioning part,
Yeah.
or that lack of faith or belief. And then it just doesn't, end well as it could have if we stayed strong on the waves. Sort of like, it just is, and those are faith building, belief building, times in our life.
Well, I think Peter and all of the apostles had their belief throughout Jesus's ministry was to a degree skewed by what they expected Jesus to be.
Right.
And so part of their belief was really in what they wanted the Messiah to be, what they expected the Messiah to be. And that belief is being transformed to understanding of who Jesus actually is. And we still have that same problem today. We can look around and find all kinds of messages about Jesus that try to change who Jesus is to fit the expectations of the world and our culture, to make him blend with what's seen as good by the world around us, instead of who he actually is.
I appreciate your tying Thomas's belief in with do you believe enough to trust your life to him? And I guess I know this, but I never really put the two together. I'm fascinated by when you read the traditions about the lives of the apostles and how accurate they are. I don't know. I like to believe that they are, but I like to read, how they were martyred, what happened, all that stuff. And I don't think I read Thomas, so I'm going to have to look him up on Wikipedia now and see what. But I think it's pretty good evidence that all or most of them died as martyrs.
Yeah.
And so Thomas, from not even believing he was resurrected, lived his life and died as a martyr because of his belief.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of the phrase that I had for belief. I can't think of what it is now. I'll come up with it, but it was, when Jesus was in his miracles, all of a sudden these people are like, yeah. And then all of a sudden he goes, hey, I don't need people like you. The only reason you believe in me is because of the miracle you saw. And he kind of like, rebukes him, like, that's not really what I'm looking for here. So that kind of comes back to level.
Because the food they got when he fed the 5,000.
Yeah. But when the teachings got hard, they're like, whoa, no. Never mind. Nope, sorry, I'm out. Yeah. So All right, I'm gonna stop the recording in case we want to hang around here and